Of all the people who've climbed Australia's highest mountains, one stands tall. Ecologist Alec Costin spent his working life learning about the Australian Alps and the importance of high country catchments to the health of the nation's major river systems. And while his groundbreaking work in the 1950s had a lasting impact, he says there's still a lot of work to be done to protect Australia's unique alpine ecology.
At the roof of Australia, three wise men take in a view they help protect and conserve for all Australians.
The three of us here have been colleagues for 70 or 80 years, and it's great to get together once again and see some of the good results of work that we've been involved in.
Now long retired and rising 90, Alec Costin is a giant in the field of alpine ecology. With his colleagues Dane Wimbush and Roger Good, he helped identify the serious damage sheep and cattle grazing was doing in the Snowy Mountains, guiding a conservation effort in the 1950s that literally saved one of Australia's most important catchments.
It's great satisfaction for the three of us to be together on these ruddy mountains, probably for the last time.
Do you still feel the same buzz that you used to when you came up here?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I don't think there's ever been a day that any of us, or three of us, would come here individually or otherwise, that you don't get a buzz, because every day is different.
And there are the crags you can pick up on the skyline.
This month, the New South Wales Parks and Wildlife Service honoured the trio with a final trip together to gather photographic data of their seminal work.
And there's one of our reference rocks right there.
Thanks, guys.
It was a real moonscape in those days.
It certainly was.
And it's not so much as a moonscape today.
As seen in this Australian Screen documentary, the Alps were still being grazed in the 1950s, and Australia's fragile alpine ecology was under attack.
When the first stockmen brought up stock to the mountains as early as 100 years ago, they found these natural grass plains surrounded by large belts of snow gum. Their first job was to burn and to keep on burning the snow gum and the woody shrubs to enlarge the natural grass plains. Since that time, the fire stick has been used intentionally again and again throughout the Snowy Mountains.
Alec Costin was the first scientist to identify how damaging this was to the Snowy Mountains catchment, and his groundbreaking report led to a total ban of grazing in the New South Wales Alps. What followed was a major conservation effort. This film is of restoration for the Snowy Mountains hydro scheme, but governments had also become acutely aware of the value of conserving the alpine ecology.
Grass and clover will thus find a suitable seed bed undisturbed by water runoff and surface erosion.
So how do you put a value on conservation and biodiversity? Well, here in the Alps, that's pretty easy, because the system contributes about 30% of all the flow into the Murray-Darling Basin system. In any given year, that could be worth between $4 and $8 billion. That early high country conservation work had a huge impact, but according to Alec Costin, the damage from grazing remains, and there's still a lot of work to do.
In the grazing days, this area was highly selectively overgrazed, simply because the vegetation here was so extremely palatable. So this is not only the largest wetland in the mountains, it is by far the most difficult one to regenerate. And like the rest of the mountains, this area shows remarkable recovery, but the wetlands are the weak point of it.
They may look beautiful, but these streams should be covered in vegetation. Throughout the Alps, swamps and moss beds are crucial for filtering water out of the mountains.
They've had a checkered history. First of all, the grazing really impacted on them, and a lot of them were very badly eroded, and they lost a lot of that water holding capacity and filtration. And then the 2003 fires just devastated. Something like 90% of the bogs were burnt in those 2003 fires, and for some of the sites it was catastrophic.
Botanists Jenny Wynnum and Genevieve Wright are working on a program to restore the wetlands in Kosciuszko.
Oh wow, look at this. This is obviously a spring here. Look at the moss bed around it. Some of the bogs have recovered better than we could have hoped. Some of them haven't recovered as well. But these last couple of years we've seen a real improvement in the bogs, and I think by stopping the incision in the peats and holding the water high in the catchment, we helped hold that damaged ecosystem together until the snows and rains came and did what only they can do, and that is recharge these water systems.
Now the swampy bogs and fens face a new and even greater threat. Feral horses, or brumbies, are increasing in huge numbers throughout the Alps. In Kosciuszko alone, there are more than 6,000, and that is growing by up to 16% a year. Across the Australian Alps, there could be between 12,000 and 15,000 brumbies, and their impact is being most felt in the delicate wetlands.
Because they're hard-hooved animals, the vegetation evolved free of hard-hooved animals. So there's no sustainable population that people talk about often. You know, what's a sustainable population of wild horses, brumbies, call them what you will, in the park?
Roger Good is in a group of scientists calling for urgent action and reminding governments of their obligations under the Threatened Species and National Parks and Wildlife Acts.
There's no ecological reason to have any horses in the park. So there's a requirement to actually remove them, legally remove them. So when we do that and how we do it is another thing.
The New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service currently has a trap and relocate policy, but it admits this is inadequate. An independent science and technical reference committee is now investigating solutions, including culling.
It's a complex issue because you have a conservation issue and the need to protect the reserve and its natural values. You have the human side of the issue with people loving the sight of wild horses in the bush, and it's one that we have to get an answer to. And our chief responsibility is around managing the reserve for its natural and cultural values, and that's what has to drive us.
Alec Costin says people have an emotional attachment to horses, but hard decisions are needed.
There will be enormous support for politicians not to do anything.
The on-again, off-again saga of grazing in the Victorian Alps is, according to Alec Costin, a prime example of politics interfering with good policy. Cattlemen have long argued that limited grazing helps manage bushfires, and so-called green management plans do more damage than good.
As a Mountain Cattlemen organisation, our passion will prove that our argument works. And if our argument works, it allows us to continue with our heritage, our culture, our tradition, our love of the bush, and do a hell of a job by the bush as well.
Last year, the Coalition supported a scientific trial of grazing in the high country.
To see the noxious weeds that have permeated through the whole area, it seems to me fairly logical that cattle grazing would keep those issues at bay. However, I do want to put some scientific rigour around that.
The new Victorian government has stopped the grazing trial, which was widely criticised as unscientific. Alec Costin believes the support for grazing was more about votes than science. He says it was one example of science being used for political ends, and he's also worried about a growing trend in Australia towards research funded by vested interests.
Another way of putting this crudely is that the donors of that big money have got a vested interest in getting the result that they want. The political support for research is diminishing, and what is suffering is fundamental research. And there must be a balance between fundamental research, which may not seem useful at the moment, but eventually it will be very useful indeed.
We have achieved a great deal since the days of 1788. We have destroyed most of the bush and replaced it with open croplands and pastures.
50 years ago, Alec Costin appeared in an ABC television series called The Case for Conservation. He says it was a mark of how seriously Australia considered this issue back then.
What then is the overall case for conservation? We see the world's population skyrocketing at an unprecedented rate. This is imposing increasing demands on the natural resources of the world, some of which are being consumed more rapidly than they can be renewed. The challenge of conservation is to ensure that the good things of life, which we now enjoy, will be available also to future generations.
The pendulum is now swinging the other way, and partly because of the increasing politicisation of science, the truth is easily used or misused.
He believes climate change science has been abused by politics, but he says Australia may face bigger environmental challenges than global warming. The national plan to increase food production by 50% in the next 15 years could cause irreversible damage.
I fear that the damage and the permanent damage to pushing our soil resources too hard to feed an increasing number of billions of people will result in a certain degree of irreversibility, where the soil on which we depend and which is now being pressed to its limits will in places be pressed too hard. And when that time comes, and it may be a far more significant episode in our environment than the present episode in so-called contaminating the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and producing global warming. Well, I don't think anyone could design a more complete and beautiful alpine garden than this one that occurs naturally.
Back in the mountains, Alec Costin had one last visit to his favourite place, a beautiful alpine garden beneath the peak of Mount Twynham. Time to reflect on a brilliant career and a benefit to the human condition that cannot be measured.
What I really love about this area is that I find it a fresh and beautiful experience every time I come here, even though I've been here hundreds of times before. The important thing for everyone is to find themselves, and they can really only find themselves by themselves in beautiful environments such as this.